Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, and we are live on Facebook /Voice of America, so you can send us your comments and questions. And we now know more about the planning of the announced summit between the United States and North Korea. United States President Donald Trump tweeted confirmation that the director of the CIA on Easter weekend secretly met with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong Un. Now, this comes as Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is meeting with President Trump at the president's home in Florida. Abe is a key U.S. partner in any deal with North Korea. Here to help us understand the complicated threads to VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman, who is with the president in Florida. Steve, tell us about CIA Director Pompeo's secret trip over Easter weekend to North Korea.
Well, we don't know much about it except that he went there and came back, and this was pulled off with amazing secrecy. And last night, there were various media reports leaking out about this. Shortly after the president made a very tantalizing comment to the poll reporters at Mar-a-Lago as he and the First Lady, along with Mr. and Mrs. Abe, were doing what was called a friendship walk on the grounds of his private estate. And at the end of that, one of the poll reporters asked the president, "Are you talking to Kim Jong Un?" The president turned around, faced the reporter, and said yes with a broad smile on his face, immediately causing pandemonium. Now, a few minutes later, he walked back that comment a little bit, saying we want to stop a little bit short of that, when he was asked the question again by the same reporter at the start of dinner with the Abes. And then Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, issued a statement denying that there had been any direct contact with Kim Jong Un. Of course, the president has now said that indeed that has happened, but still a bit of a mystery whether the president of the United States has spoken to the leader of North Korea.
Why is Prime Minister Abe at Mar-a-Lago, the president's home in Florida, in the first place? I mean, what drew him there? Was it the thought of a North Korea summit between the United States and North Korea?
Well, that was the main item on the first day of the agenda. The Japanese are quite concerned that perhaps on a one-on-one meeting between the president and the North Korean leader, that President Trump might make some concessions which would harm the security interests of Japan. So the prime minister wanted to speak to the president face-to-face. These two are no strangers. They have met and talked for more than any other leader foreign leader that President Trump has had any conversations with during his presidency. Now, the second thing is trade, of course. Trump pulled the United States out of that Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 12-nation trade pact that took years to negotiate. He's now talked about returning to that under the right conditions. There's been some talk of a bilateral free trade agreement between Japan and the United States. And of course, Japan has not been exempted from the steel and aluminum tariffs that the United States has imposed on imports.
All right, let me just move to another part of the world, to Russia. We've heard from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, U.S. UN Ambassador, saying that there would be more sanctions on Russia. And then following that, we get some other sort of conflicting. The president's economic advisor says that's not so. They had a little bit of a spat where he said that she was confused. She said, no, I was not confused. So where are we on this?
Right. I was in the room yesterday when the president's new economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, came into the room and said that Nikki Haley was confused. And the administration, of course, all week's been walking back that there would be new sanctions on Russia. And the UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, pushed back on that immediately, saying she wasn't confused at all. And that forced an apology from Kudlow, who, as you know, was a longtime a commentator on television about economic matters. And when he was up at the podium yesterday, that was an off-camera briefing, but on the record, I think he still thought he was on a television set and perhaps did not temper his comments like someone in the administration should do.
Well, she certainly sort of slapped him down on that one. Anyway, thank you very much, Steve.
My pleasure.
Joining me to talk about the national security challenges facing the Trump White House, Daniel Twining, Asia expert and president of the International Republican Institute. Mr. Twining has advised, among others, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Senator John McCain on foreign policy. Joshua Walker is the head of Global Strategic Initiatives at the Eurasia Group. He's a transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And we're going to come back to our panel shortly. First, this.
I think he absolutely gets credit. I mean, he's moved the needle where we have not been able to through three previous administrations, in the sense that to have the negotiations. And there will be critics of his move right now, as I was with someone yesterday that spoke about the fact that this is meeting with the United States president. It's been something that his father, Kim Jong Un's father, and Kim Jong Un's grandfather wanted to do, and that's finally going to happen. All of that, from my perspective, is I'm willing to pay that price if the outcome can be one where that peninsula gets denuclearized and the risk of any kind of use of nuclear weapons and war, quite frankly, goes way down. So that's where we are. There's going to be a lot of speculation between now and when President Trump and Kim Jong Un meet, and I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. The other thing Kim Jong Un has said is that he's willing to denuclearize. Well, that's code for a long, long time, and I think that needs to be very visible to include, and what Kim Jong Un, at least historically, what that has meant is U.S. troops out of South Korea. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future, so that he says this. People that have negotiated this before, it's very clear what that has meant in the past, and the question is, for this leader, does it mean the same thing?
What would you offer Kim Jong Un? I mean, what would you say at the table? What's the threat, or what encourages him to? I mean, what do we have to offer, or how do we deter him?
He has, I think he has a view, or he's got some international exposure, more than his father and his grandfather, for sure, because of his education background in Europe. And he has voiced a desire to be recognized internationally. And I would include in this discussion the need for him to improve dramatically his human rights situation, which is a disaster. And I'd want to put as much pressure on him in that regard as I could. But I think, I'd be willing to certainly have a discussion about if he's willing to give those weapons up, and I mean give them up, no kidding, and have it verifiable, which is a huge challenge.
But he's going to want something.
No, I understand that. I think the whole the economic world, if you will, the trade world, not just through China, but to be.
But you've got to care about your people, and if you've got all these humanitarian problems, I mean, where's the indication he cares about his people? Well, he's taking care of himself in the military.
I think he has to start doing that. Whether he cares or not is unimportant. I think he's going to have to do that, and that needs to be part of what's seen as well. And I think actually there's enough NGO contact with North Korea now to give us a good read on that. So then he starts to be recognized, I think, more internationally. He's not the pariah that he is right now. And in the long run, I think that's what he seeks. The other thing is, I'd need to hear from him on what does he want. We don't hear that very often. Clearly, the other thing that doesn't get much visibility is the relationship between North Korea and China historically, as well as now. It's not a charmed relationship. They've struggled with each other.
And that was Admiral Mike Mullen, former Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, a very, very powerful person in the United States for a number of years. Joshua, first to you, the secret meeting that CIA Director Pompeo had, now confirmed by the President Trump in a tweet. Why?
I think in many ways it's setting the stage. I think the way that Donald Trump has focused on foreign policy making has been kind of mano a mano. He wants to have a direct relationship. It's clear he doesn't trust or kind of look at the institutions that normally would do this. A lot of critics here in Washington have said it takes a long time, it takes a lot of people to get this done. He took his most trusted advisor, sit him there to kind of have eyes and ears on the ground. It's clear that Pompeo has the ear of the president. He's going to be driving this forward. And the question is there any coincidence that this happened yesterday on the day that the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate was putting some pretty serious roadblocks up towards Mike Pompeo becoming the next Secretary of State? Well,
that's sort of interesting, Dan, is that that this would be typically sort of a diplomatic function, and we would have the Secretary of State doing it. But Pompeo, who's CIA director, may soon be Secretary of State. He may soon be moved over from the CIA to State.
So
There's a compelling argument that this is the cabinet member who's closest to Donald Trump, one of them, that he can speak for the president, as Rex Tillerson could not.
But he still could have done that as CIA director with Tillerson had stayed.
Correct, but also that he is a hawk. You know, traditionally hawks make better peace deals for the United States than doves because adversaries take them a little more seriously. I think one thing we're both worried about is whether our allies get cut out of this deal, right? The U.S. position in Asia depends on the U.S.-Japan alliance. And Japan is not part of this deal making. The Prime Minister of Japan is trying to keep up and catch up with what's happening. But this does not work without our allies, and that's a big test. Which
is sort of interesting because you have the April 27th summit between South Korea and North Korea, so they'll be talking. You've got Pompeo talking to Kim Jong Un, so they're talking, that's the U.S. North Korea, and maybe a summit with the president. You've got Kim Jong Un's trip to China. The only one who's sort of left out of the fold here is Japan, and the Prime Minister's down at Mar-a-Lago.
I mean, I think in some ways this is a complete contrast to last year at this time. Last year when Prime Minister Abe went to Mar-a-Lago, the first foreign visitor taken to Donald Trump's winter White House, it was all love. It was all kind of standing shoulder to shoulder. This time the Japanese are nervous, and as you pointed out, right after this visit, Prime Minister Abe will actually be going to Moscow to meet with President Putin. So Russia and Japan are also trying to figure out a way of hedging. But as Dan already pointed out, this deal between the U.S. and North Korea will not work internationally unless our allies are on board. It's clear that South Korea is in the middle of this. Where's Japan? Can we bring Japan on board with us? We're going to see today how that goes. But yesterday was not an auspicious start.
Dan, I think it's clear what we want. We want the nuclear weapons program in North Korea shut down, eliminated, never to come back. But Kim Jong Un is going to want something in return. What does he want? What could the U.S. possibly give him to shut down his program?
So democracies make the best partners and allies. We can trust them, we can work with them. He is running a system, as you pointed out to Admiral Mullen, that is Orwellian, that has people in gulags, that has a cult of personality around him and his family dynasty. He assassinates people he doesn't like with anti-aircraft guns and dogs and other things. He is running a nasty piece of business as a government. I think we will need to make a pretty tough gut check as Americans on whether this is someone who can keep up his end of a deal.
But what is he? He's got to want something. I mean, he's got to say, okay, I'll give up my weapons, but you got to do X. What?
I think there's going to be a high price. We've seen this before, many times before, Greta. We've seen that the North Koreans demand money, they demand food, and usually the person
cheat,
that pays,
then.
Exactly. And the one who gets cheated the most is actually the Japanese. They constantly have been footing the bill, and they're the ones that have been left behind. That's exactly why Abe's in Florida right now to try to convince Donald Trump of that.
Do you see any agreement work on North Korea getting rid of their weapons?
I think that's going to be very hard to see how that plays out.
No, in Congress, you know, the Iran nuclear deal, Congress did not support, that did not have a majority in the Senate. This is going to have a tough time getting through our Congress, particularly if resources are involved, as they were in the 90s when we bought these light water reactors for the North Koreans, and they immediately began cheating on the deal.
Well, President Trump in this summit that we're all anticipating to occur in May or June, he has said it may happen or it may not happen. And I guess the Pompeo trip really makes a difference in terms of what he brought back to the president. But gentlemen, stay with us. Former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Admiral Mike Mullen said he was encouraged that China is taking the North Korea situation seriously. He called China a growing giant, and how it grows is critical to how the world is shaped this century.
I think outside put the Korean Peninsula problem and challenges aside, the South China Sea is a huge issue, and it's very clear from my perspective that China thinks it's theirs. There's this 9-line diagram they drew in, I think, 1947, and literally since then they think that it's theirs to own, and they assert that. That has been legally found to be not correct. That hasn't deterred them, and they are militaries in the South China Sea. And I'm not sure what Chinese leader said it, but not too long ago the leader said that the Pacific Ocean is a big ocean. Why don't you just take, the United States, you take everything east and we'll take everything west. We'll just draw a line down the middle. To me, that's what China would like to see happen. And I think it's important for us to not cede that space, to continue to be out there. We've got a big military presence in that part of the world. It has over decades provided a mechanism to support stability. I'm not sure I could say the breadbasket of the world, but it is a huge, you've got 4 of the 5 biggest economies in the world that are sort of centered there, and a conflict in that part of the world or ceding it to China from that standpoint, the outcomes on the economic side would be a disaster for the world. So I think we're going to be there for a long time, and that's the message we've got to send to China.
But there seems to be sort of China's not stopping. They're moving forward, and you've got all the oil there, you've got all the natural gas there, you've got all the natural resources in terms of fish there, but you've also got about 30% of the world transportation by boat there.
Yeah.
So I mean, the more that they take control of that area, the more dangerous it is to economies and perhaps military presence with those bases.
No, I agree. And in fact, China's been very aggressive. What the interesting thing that's happened in all this is the countries who are in the region have become much more aligned with the United States and with Western interests as China has pushed hard in the South China Sea. So Vietnam, Singapore, Laos, Cambodia, et cetera. We've got a long-standing relationship with the Philippines, which is an important, they're an important partner. But your point about the resources is a really important one. Not oftentimes stated, but there are enormous resources there in terms of gas and oil. And China is a growing giant that just needs to consume all those resources. And in the end, I really think that's what this is about. And they are, in fact, Robert Kagan spoke to a theory I listened, or a thesis about the South China Sea a year ago, is essentially what they're doing is what the United States did in the Caribbean in the early 1900s, sort of stabilizing their local waters, figuring out how to control them. And then once they do that, they will start projecting power around the world, which is exactly what we did. And in a way, they are copying what we did. So that's why how China grows and what our relationship is long-term is really critical. If it's constructive, if we can have a constructive relationship with them, then I think that's good for the world. If it's destructive, then I think it's really bad for the world. And that's what we've got to sort out. I actually believe that in this century, the most important bilateral relationship globally is the one between the U.S. and China.
Dan, this whole idea of the South China Sea, and there's the encroachment. Obviously, China wants the South China Sea, so the U.S. is at odds with China's goals on the South China Sea, as well as other nations. And you've got the trade problem. Yet the U.S. needs China for North Korea. So how do you reconcile that?
So we need to have a stable relationship with China. However, China is pushing out. I hate to disagree with Admiral Mullen. I don't think the South China Sea is like the Caribbean. Between 30 and 40% of all world trade is moving through the South China Sea. It's an economic artery and lifeline of the global economy, and no one power can control it. Without putting the global economy at risk.
China sure wants to control it, and it's not making the Philippines happy, it's not making South Korea happy, it's not making Japan happy, and they're building these little islands, and they're also building military bases.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the question is this like the new cockpit of great power rivalry in the 21st century? Is it a sideshow, right? China does want to go global. It wants to project out of Asia. It wants to wedge apart the U.S. and its allies over time, and we've got to be very mindful about that.
Joshua, is it an economic interest that's driving China in the China Sea, or is it a military interest?
I think it's both in some ways. If you control that sea lane, it basically breaks up the entire international liberal order that the United States set up after World War II, and all of our allies are there. Admiral Mullen pointed out pretty clearly, the allies in the region, which we used to have a hard time trying to convince that this was a big deal, that we can't just have our ships go other ways. We need to have a free and open. And what's interesting is U.S. strategy now is trying to link both India and Japan as kind of these main focal points in the Indo-Pacific and bring all of our allies together. That's what America does best, when we bring our allies together. Right now, if we have a direct tit-for-tat kind of conversation, the bilateral between U.S. and China, this can't be left out because our allies will not forget at that point.
Do you not see China, though, as moving forward and gaining much more ground than anybody is trying to push them back on? I mean, this is moving forward. This is not, as we're all concentrating on nuclear weapons or on sanctions on Russia, China is moving forward on this very important economic thoroughfare.
You're absolutely right. If you ask me what is the major challenger to the U.S.-led order and the Marshall Plan that we set up after World War II, it's the Chinese One Belt, One Road. And that One Belt, One Road goes through Eurasia on the land side. It also has a maritime route, and this is the critical artery right there that it goes through.
And I imagine that the Prime Minister in Japan is probably discussing that pretty closely with President Trump down at Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, and this is one of the risks with the president's bilateral approach, which is that the way you gain leverage on China is with your allies, is by having a posture in the region that is reinforced by all of your military and economic partnerships. That's where TPP comes in. That's where some of the multilateral structures come in. No country wants to stand up to China by themselves because China's bigger than almost all of them.
Stand by, gentlemen. I asked Admiral Mullen whether he thinks the president of China, or Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump are the most important people in the world.
When I talk about what's going on in the world, and you talk about the difficulties that we have around the world, not the United States, but the world is having, the one thing I worry about the most is the lack of leadership. And the people that are moving the needle right now, two of the people moving the needle are Xi Jinping and Putin, and they're the wrong guys as far as I'm concerned. I described sort of a later rival to the leadership lineup, which has been a pleasant surprise, is the Pope, who I think is moving the needle in the right direction when it's focused on the people in need, and that we need to understand that and figure that out. And in many ways, we've lost our way in that regard with respect to those that the have-nots.
If you look at President Xi and President Putin, though, and those two nations, they are trying to grow. They are encroaching, whether it's a China Sea or a Crimea. The United States, at least I don't think, is trying to encroach. Yeah. It's trying to protect and stop the nuclearization of the world.
Yeah, I think that's always been the U.S. approach. I mean, we've never been a country that coveted territory. Clearly, you just see from what Putin's done in the recent years with Crimea and Ukraine, that's not the case. And I really do believe when Putin says the worst thing that ever happened in Russia was the fall of the wall and the destruction of the Soviet Union, and that's his vision, is to bring as much of that back as he possibly can. He's not president for life yet, but I think effectively he is. Until he can't breathe, he'll run that country. And he will do everything he possibly can to expand. We sometimes apply Western metrics to somebody like Putin. The infrastructure is bad, demographics are bad, the oil and gas is whatnot, where all those things, therefore he can't last. He's going to last. He'll have a way, and he's a very popular leader in their own country. The other thing about Russia that I think we're dealing with is when the wall came down, we didn't do what we did after World War II with Germany and Japan and try to help them recover. Instead, we actually stood on their neck. And Vladimir Putin is never, ever going to forget that. So that's who we've got to deal with from a leadership standpoint. I think he can be dealt with. We don't have many in this country that have a relationship with him, and I think that's dangerous. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, I think he's got huge internal challenges. I mean, there are external ones for sure as well. But when he's got whatever it is, 350 million people that are doing well, and another 800 million that aren't, that's the mail he has to answer as president, and as president for life, or whatever we're going to call him, as he recently affirmed. But he's got huge challenges in that regard. And can we have a relationship with them that lets us be who we are, and let, in particular, them achieve in a constructive way their own objectives? Putin and Europe, Russia and Europe, historically has always been a huge challenge. I think it's going to continue to be.
Joshua, President Putin going to last forever, and President Xi of China, is he pretty stable too?
I mean, the question is, they might last forever. The question is, will their power bases remain? Right now, we're going through a moment of weakness. There are a lot of people that look around the world and say, where is that democratic model and the strength? I think
when you say we, who's the weakness?
I think the U.S. Okay. The U.S., Britain, when I think about the Brexit vote, when I think of Europe, I think domestically we're driven apart, we're polarized, we're fighting among ourselves, we're not focused on global leadership. There are some shining examples out there. Macron of France, Abe of Japan. But even Abe of Japan is facing some major headwinds at his own home. So the question is, where is that next generation going to come up? Is it from our political leadership, or does it come from other areas like Admiral Mullen pointed out, the Pope, or is it the Mark Zuckerbergs, or is it the private sector leaders that step up? They've all had a pretty bad week, it seems.
Dan?
People everywhere want to be free. There are no cultural exceptions. We work all over the world helping to support democracy at IRI. The thing that keeps Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping up at night is that fact. They know it. They cannot control societies in the 21st century indefinitely.
But they seem to be growing. You've got Putin seems to be expanding into Crimea, or he has. You've got his influence in Syria. You've got all the influence in China President Xi. You've got the China Sea, but you've also got Kim Jong Un visiting him and basically doing some sort of. It seems like asking for help from China.
It's partly because for the last 10 years or so, we let these vacuums grow, and hostile powers have walked into them in the South China Sea, in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Syria, right? I think President Obama had a view that we won't intervene, and therefore the thing will sort of fix it out itself. But other countries do not have that view. What
would be your advice, Joshua, to President Trump if you're whispering in his ears these days?
Get as close as you can to your allies. Bring your allies along. Maybe multilateral is not your thing, but you got to work with it. That's a system that we've been given.
Do you see him doing that?
It's too early to tell.
Dan?
Let's see. If you had defined George Bush's presidency by his first year, I don't think you would have gotten the rest of it right. I think what happens in Congress matters very much. What happens in the world matters very much. And I think the input of our friends and allies in the world will also matter, as will the missteps of our adversaries.
Is that summit between President Trump and Kim Jong Un, is that going to happen? President Trump has said that it may or may not at this point.
I think if it does happen, it will be a major photo op, a major opportunity. The question is, if it doesn't happen, will it lead to something much worse?
And where will it be? That's the big debate. It can't be. I don't think that President Trump's going to go to North Korea, and I don't think Kim Jong Un's going to come to the United States.
Let's see. If they can do a deal, I mean, we shouldn't be opposed to diplomacy, right? We want a diplomatic process. But I think we just have to be really smart and understand the kind of characters we're dealing with.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And before we go, I want to talk for just a moment about former First Lady Barbara Bush. Someone I interviewed many times over the years, and Barbara Bush was most certainly never dull. And the truth be told, we in the media could often be intimidated by her. But at the same time, we also loved her. She captured our hearts. Most people knew her as the wife of a U.S. president, President Bush 41, mother of a U.S. president, President Bush 43, and mother of a U.S. governor, Florida Governor Jeb Bush. But I bet you didn't know this, and it's something you probably won't hear anyplace else. Barbara Bush was a big, big baseball fan. And a number of years ago, I went to a Major League Baseball game with Mrs. Bush and President Bush. I was their guest. Here's the photo. But she didn't just cheer for her team. She kept score, something only a real baseball lover does. Check out this photo. With her pencil, she recorded the hits, the outs, the runs, the errors of every player in the lineup. Now, that is a serious baseball fan. And that, of course, just a small part, but a fun part of Barbara Bush. We Americans, we're going to miss her. And if you want to send condolences, visit her website, barbarabush.org. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.